Up until recently, there is only one state in the country that has nurse-to-patient ratios. But it wasn't easy for the California nurses to implement these laws. There's a reason why there's only one state, up until recently, that has these nurse-to-patient ratios. And in this video, I'm gonna go over exactly what these nurses had to go through, the obstacles they had to face, the challenges, the entire system going up against them year over year, and the smart tactics that these nurses had to play in order to make this law happen and make it a reality in California. So in this video, I'm about to do a deep dive, and you guys stick around to find out exactly how these ratios came into existence in the state of California and how they molded every single nurses union across the country, and how this law became the premise for how every nurses union across the country negotiates and lobbies Congress in order to make these things a reality in their own states. Let me start at the very beginning, and it all started in the 1980s to 1990s. What was happening at the time in California was that hospitals were trying to cut costs because of the number of reimbursements they were receiving. So in order to do that, the solution they found was to reduce the number of staff, in return causing these nurses to care for patients that they could not safely care for. So there were fewer nurses, sicker patients, and more tasks that were pushed onto these nurses. And this is something that I myself was dealing with when I was working in New York City, and it still happens today. And I'll talk about that in another video, but this was too much for nurses to handle in the state of California. A common ratio on a med-surg floor at the time was 1:8, 1:10, and on night shifts, it was even worse. And ICU nurses were sometimes caring for up to 4 patients at a time. Nurses were staying way past their shift just to make sure that all of their charting was done. Within years of starting their careers, these nurses were already leaving the bedside, and they knew that something had to change. So what did these nurses do? Well, they organized, and it first started with the California Nurses Association. If you don't know about the California Nurses Association, you are about to find out, and you're going to see why they are considered the strongest union in the nation. So the early to mid 1990s rolls around, and the California Nurses Association begins to intervene. They start collecting data, they start collecting reports from the nurses who work on these floors and are understaffed and caring for more patients than they can handle. They start collecting these nurses' stories. Nurses saying that they're taking care of 10 patients, 12 patients, 13 patients at a time. Studies that show that patient mortality increased with the number of patients a nurse is assigned to take care of. And the California Nurses Association begins to put 2 and 2 together. Staffing is not just a workplace issue. It's a public safety issue. Because while these hearings are going on and nurses are attending the hearings, so are the patients and their family. Families talk about how some of these patients are harmed as a result of nurses being unable to respond in times of crisis. And in 1999, a turning point occurs. This is when Assembly Bill 394 is introduced to the state legislature in California. The bill is called the Safe Staffing for Quality Care Act, but the bill didn't have any set ratios. What it was forcing the hospitals to do, and the state, was to set a minimum number of ratios. That's all they were asking for. And then the California Nurses Union and all of these nurses fighting for ratio laws flooded the Capitol building. They attended every single hearing. And at this time, hospitals launched a campaign against this law. They had lobbyists, they had economists talking about how this was going to be the end of nursing and the hospital system as they knew it. But nurses flipped the script. They talked about how this was about saving patients' lives, not about budget constraints. And in October of 1999, the bill was passed into law. And this was unheard of. The signing of this bill was something that nurses could have only dreamed about. But after the bill was passed, it was only going to get harder for these nurses to figure out how they could implement these policies. Because now the goal was to talk about the technicalities involved in implementing these ratios from unit to unit and specialty to specialty. For 4 years, the hospital lobby and the CNA debated on the intricacies of this bill. What counts as a med-surg ratio? What counts as an ICU ratio or an ED ratio? What counts as a tele ratio? Were telemetry nurses going to get 1:4? or 1 to 5? Were LVNs going to be counted in these ratios? And were these ratios going to be counted across all shifts, or were these ratios going to apply all of the time? They also debated on whether the hospitals were going to add nurses based on the acuity level of their patients. And after hundreds and hundreds of pages, they finally came to an agreement. ICU nurses were going to have a 1 to 2 ratio. Tele nurses were going to have a 1 to 4 ratio. And med-surg nurses were going to have a 1 to 6 ratio that would later turned into a 1-to-5 ratio. ED, PACU, L&D, all these other units had their own ratios. And so, January 1st, 2004, the law takes effect. And the med-surg tightening of a ratio from 1-to-6 to 1-to-5 is scheduled to happen in 2005. But hospitals complained loudly, saying that this was going to be the end of them, that the cost to do this was going to be too high. And one thing that you probably haven't heard of is that we had a new governor in town, and his name is Arnold Schwarzenegger. Arnold Schwarzenegger came into office in the state of California through a recall election. And guess exactly who he sided with? It wasn't the nurses. The hospital lobby got a hold of Schwarzenegger so hard that he became their biggest advocate. His administration tried to delay the 1-to-5 tightening ratio for med-surg nurses, and he used emergency regulations to do this. But nurses exploded. They started attending every rally. They were at every single one of his press conferences. But this is where he messed up. He began to call nurses special interest. And this is where the CNA really leaned into it. They called themselves the special interests that saves lives. So the media starts interviewing nurses. They start interviewing patients. And a court rules that this emergency regulation set by Arnold Schwarzenegger's office is illegal. And the 1-to-5 ratio for med-surg nurses goes into full effect in 2005. The California Nurses Association and the nurses had the governor, the protests, the court battles, and the public siding with them every step of the way. So what was the aftermath? Did anything change? Did the law actually work? After this law was passed, studies were conducted. And the studies began to show that RN staffing began to increase all across California. Patient mortality decreased on medical surgical units and units after surgery. Events that were labeled as failure to rescue had decreased. Nurse burnout rates dropped compared to other states. Nurses also stayed at their jobs longer. And there were no mass hospital closures despite the predictions. California becomes the gold standard for safe staffing globally. Other states have tried and failed and failed and failed again, except for the state of Oregon. Just recently, because of the tenacity and the hard work that these nurses and the nurses unions put into place in the state of Oregon, they now have a law that is similar to that of California when it comes to nurse-to-patient ratios. And in addition to the nurses, they also have ratios for their CNAs or certified nursing assistants. But this is why California is different. California paved the way for nurses in other states to do the same. This is why nurses who come here stay here. This is why the pay is higher. And this is why you can work 3 days a week in California and not feel like you're dying inside. But this is not the end for California's ratios and the way that it's implemented, because there are still areas within the system that are lagging behind. And one of these areas was psych hospitals. It wasn't until recently that Governor Newsom passed a law ensuring that psych hospitals and facilities have strict ratios that they abide by. Otherwise, they are forced to pay these huge fines they can't afford to pay. And some hospitals still break ratios, hoping that none of the nurses are going to report it. And in some of those cases, the nurses actually do not report it. So they continue to get away with it. And during COVID, which is part of the reason why a lot of nurses burned themselves out, the state of California relaxed the nurse-to-patient ratio law. But unions continued to file complaints. They protest, they strike, and make sure that day in and day out, these ratios are enforced. And at the end of the day, this California nurse-to-patient law did not happen as a result of politicians caring for nurses or for the patients. It happened because nurses refused to accept unsafe working conditions. It took 15 years of testifying, rallying, striking, protesting, and refusing to shut up every step of the way. The law has reshaped nursing as we know it. Higher wages, better retention, safer patient care, and a place where nurses can actually have a life outside of work. California didn't magically become the best place for nurses to work in. It happened because the nurses made it happen. If you like this video and you want more videos like this, make sure you subscribe to this channel, because I'm going to be doing deep dives like this on a regular basis. And if you are a nurse who is struggling to make ends meet, I have an app. It's called Map My Pay. You can find it in the top pinned comment of this video. And it's an app built for nurses by nurses that's going to help you compare your salary and your cost of living to over 1,000 other cities in the US. And you can calculate your salary in the top paid hospitals in California to see if moving to California is going to be the right move for you. And we also have a community where nurses like me are sharing their pay stubs, their union contracts, and everything else in between. So thanks for watching this video, and I'll see you guys on the next one.